And we are live. I once again joined by the venerable American historian and gangster of Chicago, Mr. Thomas777. How are you doing today, man?
I'm very well, man. Thank you for the storied introduction, and yeah, thanks for hosting me, man. I'm glad we got an opportunity to do this again. It's always a pleasure.
It's always a pleasure, my man. So I kind of wanted to discuss the nuclear weapon drama with Russia and Ukraine. Of course, we have these shit libs on Twitter and also these military industrial complex, CIA top type people who are agitating for limited nuclear war, whatever that means. I feel like there's a lot of misconceptions around that. A lot of the older people have that the Cold War mindset of nukes that they could destroy and kill everyone on the planet. And some people are like, "Oh, the impact is very minor," and I feel like there just isn't that middle ground, like on understanding what these tactical weapons are actually for, what they can do. So, if you could elaborate on that, that would help a lot. I think.
Yeah, the way to understand nuclear weapons is this. I mean, obviously, when the atom bomb was developed, that was a huge game changer. Okay, the destructive power of it, um, of course, was a game changer, but also the political conditions that were emergent as the Second World War drew to a close. Like, mind you, the Manhattan Project, that what prompted it was Einstein confabulated. I mean, he really did. I'm not saying this only to some conceptual bias or some prejudice, ideological prejudice towards history. Einstein claimed that he had concrete evidence or knowledge, rather, that the German Reich was developing atomic weapons, as they were then known. And he, through some of his contacts on Wall Street, quite literally, ethno-sectarian contacts, he was able to get an audience with Roosevelt's war cabinet, and that's what prompted the Manhattan Project, which, for those who don't know, was the code name of the project to develop the first atomic bomb. And horrifyingly, I think it goes without saying, the atomic bomb was the Manhattan Project was again, as I just stated, it was undertaken to wage a nuclear war against Europe. Now the
Mainly Germany.
yeah, and I mean that'd be like a cold that'd be like a Muslim state saying we're going to annihilate Mecca. Okay, you don't annihilate your own ancestral homeland. Okay, I mean I don't want to go off on a I emphasize this so that people kind of can conceptualize how horrifying the ideology of the New Deal regime was. Okay, I mean this transcends right, left, ideological preferences. It supersedes issues of communism and fascism. You don't. I don't care what kind of government is situated in Berlin. You don't wage genocidal nuclear war against your own civilization. Okay, you don't do that. But as it turned out, the war in Europe ended earlier than was anticipated by some American war planners. Part of this owed to an incomplete picture of the battlefield situation. I mean, part of this owed to the fact that, I mean, strategic forecasting, even in the best of circumstances, is very opaque. I mean, that's the fog of war, figuratively and literally. Um, but as the war came to a close, and even even though in 1945, it was not anybody's contemplation that the Cold War was going to jump off as it did. It was clear that even if under a best case scenario within the bounded rationality of the New Dealer regime, and by that point, Roosevelt was dead. Truman was the president. But I mean, even let's say the New Dealer regime, let's say its ambitions had come to fruition. That being like a concord with the Soviet Union, to jointly rule over the planet. With Moscow as a junior partner. An essential aspect of that was American strategic superiority. So obviously, demonstrating the capability of the atomic bomb was something that the Department of War and the U.S. Army viewed as imperative. Okay, it was totally unnecessary to drop the atomic bomb on Japan. Japan was prostrate. It was utterly destroyed. I think that should go without saying. Okay, but that's
People
not
also
what I
forget
want.
that the Soviet Union invaded Japan the last months of the war and completely occupied their possessions in China, mainly
Yeah,
Manchuria and
yeah,
Sakhalin Island.
yeah, exactly. It's this idea that them Japs are crazy and they never surrender. I mean that's asinine beyond belief, but that's kind of a topic for another episode. But the point is, even had the Cold War not developed as it did, beginning with the Berlin airlift and kind of the the emergent hostility that led to that, and then the outright strategic the hostile strategic competition that ensued subsequent. Like even if that had not come to pass, it was imperative for whatever structure did emerge post-war, whatever global political order did emerge, for America to demonstrate absolute strategic superiority. So the atomic bomb was the way, would have been, kind of this kind of prime variable regardless. I mean, as it came to pass, I mean, the Cold War did ensue, and it became characterized by by the arms race, both of conventional forces and most critically
I
strategic
see the
nuclear
aims.
forces. Yeah. Now the distinction to bring it back, the distinction between strategic and tactical nuclear weapons, it doesn't so much owe to throw weight and destructive power. It has to do with what they're purposed for, and different platforms are purposed for strategic or tactical missions. But I mean, generally, the way to understand it is, tactical nuclear weapons are purposed for counterforce. Strategic nuclear arms are purposed for counter value. Okay, counter value is assault upon population centers. Uh, counterforce obviously is attacking military targets. Now, the U.S. military was in a strange. There's a strange. I mean, there was a strange idea that kind of permeated the nascent Pentagon, and the new Department of Defense, like reskinned as it was after the Second World War. This really began in earnest under Eisenhower, owing to kind of his technocrat's sensibility. I mean, he kind of was a consummate like technocrat. Okay, but what came to be known as the New Look, that was sort of the restructuring program. That's what the restructuring program for United States Army forces and being was characterized as. And the Army then was kind of had dominant lobbying power. Like the defense lobby has always been very powerful, and in a sense, I mean, but since 1945, obviously it's been tremendously powerful. But which service branch is kind of dominant has varied. At that point, it was still the Army. The idea was of the New Look, like okay, conventional forces and being, even combined arms, and even with then kind of nascent command and control, that allowed far more in-depth coordination, between elements. That's obsolete because nuclear weapons are just this game changer. And if you have nuclear arms, you can annihilate the enemy, before he even takes the field of battle. So why do we need to accrue conventional forces and being? Why do we need a standing army anyway? We can just perfect our nuclear capabilities. Now there's all kinds of things wrong with that. I'm not saying morally. I mean that's just not how warfare works. Okay, like Robert Heinlein said in Starship Troopers. Okay, if like a young child's misbehaving and you cut his head off, like no, you give him a spanking. Warfare is a spectrum of violence. Okay, on one end is total war, it's like unrestricted total nuclear war where nothing is off limits, no means are off limits, no targets are spared. Okay, regardless, of age, sex, overall health, anything else. On the other side of it is, hostility that is clear and present, but the competition they're in is carried out entirely it's entirely occulted. It's carried on in the form of espionage activities, assassinations that are carried out with plausible deniability, subterfuge, legerdemain, things like this. Okay, there's not just this binary setting of we're at war or not at war, and if we're at war, nuclear weapons can solve whatever exigency presents itself. I mean, this should be obvious, but it really wasn't then. And also, there was always weird budgetary constraints or considerations that played into the defense debate in America. This changed somewhat as time went on, and I think there was a more serious understanding of what full spectrum dominance entailed. But part of this was typical kind of like Washington politicking, like, hey, how can we get the most bang for our buck? And hey, it's expensive to keep standing armies. If we can stockpile, nuclear weapons, and have a strategic bomber force that is reliable, hey, we can have the world's greatest deterrent, and we can have the ability to apply the most firepower anywhere on this planet, and it'll be we can do it for a great bargain. I mean that kind of crass utilitarianism that seems almost like satirical, that really did shape people's conceptual horizon in Washington and in defense planning circles. I mean, people quickly became disabused of this as kind of the battles, the proxy wars between U.S. allied client regimes and communist insurgencies jumped off, and it became clear that firepower doesn't solve all problems. I mean, and it's oversimplifying it, but for our purposes, I think that's a useful way to understand it. But be as it may, the issue with nuclear weapons, as what game theorists and strategic war planners came to call deeper parodies emerged. Things like, to your point, things like ICBMs, devices that weren't, smart weapons didn't exist yet, but weapons platforms are circular error probable, which dramatically reduced. Use of multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles, multiple warhead platforms. The use of decoys, to spoof anti-ballistic missile defense systems, things like this. Okay, the use of computers to calculate threat indicators, as to when the opposing force would the ability to translate indicators into codable inputs, to determine levels of readiness and things of this sort. It became clear that it was very probable. It was, if not probable, it was entirely possible that America at some point would have to fight a general nuclear war. And as William Odom said some decades later, General William Odom, your job, if you're in the executive branch, in any command capacity, civilian or military, it's your job first and foremost to protect the country. Okay, and if within your within the penumbra of that command authority is nuclear war, it's your responsibility to fight and win a nuclear war. Okay, at all costs. Okay, it's not acceptable to throw your hands up and say, like, nuclear weapons are an abomination, and nobody wins in a nuclear war. No. Okay, if you're the commander of Strategic Air Command, or if you're the commander of U.S. Army forces in Europe, or if you're the president of the United States, you damn well better fight a nuclear war to win it, if God forbid it happens. Okay, and I'm certainly not somebody who thinks the Cold War is this great thing. I don't even think it should have been fought in the terms most people would conceptualize it, but that's again, it's a subject for another pod. But as this as technology and the political situation and strategic situation became more complex, you have strategic planners like Herman Kahn and Thomas Schelling. But Herman Kahn was I think in a lot of ways more significant. He wrote a book in 1964 called On Thermonuclear War. Okay, obviously it was a homage to Clausewitz, who wrote On War, but Kahn's book was twofold. He basically wanted to help social scientists outside of kind of the military and game theory planning community. You want to like sociologists, like political science types, economists, who in those days had quite a bit of cachet. The public intellectual as like a role in kind of political life. It had very much cachet in the early mid '60s. Still, he kind of wanted to give those people a better understanding of kind of the key features of nuclear war planning and like the exigencies, the problems, the objectives. And give just kind of like a full spectrum understanding, in basic terms. Okay, like obviously you can't you can't take like an intelligent layman and educate him on every aspect of nuclear war in some like 300-page volume. But more importantly, Kahn's thesis was essentially, look, nuclear weapons are like any other weapons. They're just far, far more muscle bound. Okay, their destructive power is exponentially greater. Okay, however, they at the end of the day, they still are just a weapon of war. Okay, and you've got to incorporate new technologies into the warfare paradigm, but the war paradigm doesn't change. Okay, the metrics of victory may change, okay, like with technology, but the basic ethos of preparing to utilize available technologies and perfect them so as to edge out the capabilities of the opposing force, and then utilize them in a way that that maximizes odds for victory. That's the way you need to look at nuclear weapons. Okay, you can't look at them as just this thing that, well, there's this thing that exists, but they can never ever be used, and we're just gonna stockpile them, to essentially make sure they are never used. I mean, that's perverse. That doesn't make any sense. And it's the equivalent of like two men like permanently like pointing guns at each other and saying, "I promise I'll never shoot you, but I will never ever holster my weapon because I don't trust you." So we're just gonna have this endless Mexican standoff. I mean, obviously, like there's complexities that aren't present in that counterfactual or in that metaphor, but in ethical terms as well as strategic ones, that holds up. Now, what was mutually assured destruction, and why is that bandied about still? Assured destruction, that actually is a meaningful concept in game theory. Assured destruction is the point at which you've killed an enemy society in nuclear war. Okay, to be totally blunt about it, that's the casualty tipping point at which the enemy can no longer reconstitute as a society and continue to wage war. Okay. In 1965, McNamara and the people within his within his kind of immediate
inner circle.
Yeah, thank you. They calculated that in order to reach that tipping point in the general nuclear war against the Soviet Union, you'd probably have to kill about a third of their population. Okay, which would probably be about 60 million people. Okay, at that time, which is a horrific. That's horrific attrition. It's almost inconceivable. Okay, but that's what was realistic as to the reality of weapons technology and the strategic landscape. People really ran with this idea of assured destruction. Now, people like von Neumann, like a lot of science fiction geeks know of von Neumann because of what he wrote about speculative. He wrote speculative papers on like artificial intelligence and on the probability of like extraterrestrial life within our galaxy. He was a fascinating guy, but he also was an atomic scientist, and he wrote a lot about nuclear war. And von Neumann talked about mutually assured destruction. Okay, that's the point at which basically there's a general nuclear war between combatants, in the United States and the Soviet Union, NATO and Warsaw Pact. And with approximate parity in forces, and the absence of deeper parodies, that would allow, one to edge out the other's capabilities and neutralize them. You're looking at a situation where probably they're both going to annihilate each other's capacity to reconstitute and make war. So you're going to be left with basically that's what mutual destruction is, okay? It's, 1965, there's 40 million dead Americans, there's 60 million dead people in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. There's in the global north, the once great cities of America and Europe are smoldering ruins. The global south is not great, but I mean, people are still alive, living their life. Don't get me wrong, that would have been a catastrophic situation. It would totally and permanently and irreparably change life as we know it, as we've ever known it. It probably would have set man back in some places, 1,000 years. But it would not mean the end of the world or nuclear winter, and the blotting out of the sun for a millennium or something. This was hysterical bullshit polemic. Also, it presumes Carl Sagan, who really, I mean, he speaking of public intellectuals, he was this big disarmament advocate kind of his whole life. And then he kind of got a new lease on life in the 80s when space-based nuclear weapons platforms, became a reality. And I mean, that's a whole other fascinating topic. But he people like him would always claim that there's no way to win in nuclear war. And there's a presumption therein that nuclear war is all or nothing. Either it's totally unrestricted, counter value assault, no targets exempted.
You're watching the entire arsenal.
Yeah, or they're not utilized. There's no reason to believe that. Don't get me wrong, nuclear war can rapidly get out of control, and among other things, owing to a lack of survivable command and control systems and communication systems. I mean, frankly, the reason we're able to have this conversation now is because the internet was a survivable command and control mechanism that was literally designed and built to survive a nuclear war. That's it. It wasn't, the internet wasn't created so that people can download pornography and post on Twitter. But by the 1980s, there were some really fascinating war game simulations, literal war games that not just were executed at command posts and key theaters like the German border. These were done in the White House, by the Secretary of Defense, the National Security Advisor, the president's entire national security cabinet. Sometimes the president himself would play the game. Other times, if he had other, if he couldn't, going to say he was on a state visit to Sweden, that day or something. They'd have somebody stand in for him, the Secretary of the Treasury or something. But this was taken very seriously, and you can find the game packets. There's certain stuff redacted because it's so classified, but you can get the gist of it, and it's dope. I mean, I'm fascinated by that kind of stuff. But what you glean from reading this is let's say a bolt from the blue nuclear war or a rapid escalation. Let's say in 1980. Let's say World War III jumped off because in the North Atlantic, there's a naval engagement, between the United States Navy and the Royal Navy and the Soviet Navy. And the Soviets decide, they're going to launch backfire bombers and just nuke the carrier battle group. So the Royal Navy and the U.S. Navy. The Pentagon would have known that happened because they just would have disappeared. Suddenly, the USS Kitty Hawk or whatever, there would no longer be, any kind of electronic signature for it, and they'd no longer be able to reach it. Okay, so it's a nuclear war when a nuclear war is underway, you have to fill in the gaps based on what is not there. Okay, among other things. So yeah, and because the window of decision making is so narrow, it's okay, do I assume that do I assume that this was simply a one-time counter-force assault, or has the Soviet Union launched some kind of mass nuclear attack, and it is going all in? I have all of 15 minutes to decide what to do, because after 15 minutes, if it is if it is a general nuclear assault, Washington D.C. is going to be hit. within minutes. Secondary command and control center is going to be hit. All that's going to remain to counterstrike is Cheyenne Mountain and the Looking Glass airborne command post. So it's like, what do I do? It's like, well, they're in the problem wise. However, what's more likely, like a bolt from the blue nuclear assault was never particularly probable. I mean, it's conceivable. There's scenarios where when human decision makers are truly removed from the equation, when it becomes not just not probable, but it becomes possible that would be the best course of action. I'm within about a rationality of nuclear war. I'm not saying this would be a good thing in like absolute terms. That's why the movie War Games like riffs on that, but in an intelligent way. And that was a real thing, but aside from that, okay, generally, even though combat is incredibly confusing, even with the fog of war being a very real thing, with all these variables, you're generally not going to be faced with a scenario. I mean, even during the Cold War, where there was this very binary, kind of conflict diet, you're not going to be faced with a situation where just out of the blue, the Soviets launch a mass nuclear assault on the U.S. Navy, or suddenly there's like 800 incoming ICBMs in the continental United States. What's going to happen is it's like, okay, there's some political crisis, it becomes a military crisis. There's a collision of forces like in the inter-German border. As the Soviets begin, or as Warsaw Pact begins, overrunning NATO force on the North German plain. The Bundeswehr and the U.S. Army, they start like launching tactical nuclear weapons, and advancing like Soviet tank columns and like blowing them to kingdom come. And then it's like, how the Soviets retaliate? Do they respond in kind? Do they decide that they're going to escalate by just like knocking the UK out of the war? And launching some kind of genuine, general counter value strike on the UK. To escalate, as a warning, but then it's like, how do you retaliate to that? So this can rapidly get out of control, okay? But the point is, there is still like a process of escalation. Like I said, there is something to the famous phrase, cooler heads prevail. That's a Curtis LeMayism. And I got a lot of respect for Curtis LeMay, and he's unfairly painted as some kind of brute. And don't get me wrong. I mean, he could be a very brutal individual. Okay. I mean, a man in his role would have to be, but during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when it became clear that there were, in fact, Soviet intermediate range ballistic missiles being based in Cuba, Kennedy's National Security Cabinet, they briefed him on possible options. Okay. And I think most people are familiar with that. I think Kennedy opted for a combination of the stick and the carrot, proverbially speaking, and the blockade, as well as forcing like wrong-footing Khrushchev in the court of world opinion. It was a very nuanced and actually pretty brilliant ploy. But what LeMay wanted to do, LeMay said, "Look, like we got to assault now." He's like, "We got to full assault on Cuba. We got to knock out those missiles at all costs, because if we don't, this establishes a precedent wherein we're going to tolerate this kind of deployment, in the Western Hemisphere. Plus, like we want to knock Cuba off the board anyway." Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Near the U.S. border, I mean, the U.S. sphere of influence.
Yeah, exactly. And this is like Monroe Doctrine stuff that long precedes, the development of nuclear weapons. But so Kennedy's like, well, he's like, General, if we invade Cuba, we're gonna kill thousands of Russian soldiers. Like, what are the Soviets gonna do? They're gonna do something. And LeMay's like, yeah, they're gonna do something, but they're not gonna assault West Berlin. And Kennedy's like, why? And LeMay's like, well, because that would lead to the unthinkable. Okay, so cooler heads will prevail. basically like what nullifies the potential of catastrophic escalation is that man is basically a rational actor within the context of power political activity, and nuclear weapons don't change that. It makes decisions a lot more final. It makes decisions to attack a lot more catastrophic at scale in terms of the human cost, but it doesn't somehow like abolish rationality from the process or transform everybody into some kind of madman. And LeMay was actually right. I think I would have been playing with fire to assault Cuba, but the like LeMay said, the enemy would have been hamstrung in his ability to respond, just by nuclear escalation. Plus, I mean, it's like, what does that get you? See, the problem with nuclear weapons is because they are binary. Let's say, let's say this. Let's say Khrushchev did, push the proverbial button and give a general order, that Soviet strategic rocket forces assault West Germany. Like, what? How does it help the Soviet Union if West Germany is a smoldering radioactive crater with 60 million dead people in it? I mean, there's not.
It's not very valuable to capture.
No, and also it's not really. Nuclear weapons don't really have a plausible military mission. Like the conflict paradigm where they do have great utility is when the world is literally divided, in bipolar terms. Any states, any other like major powers, like regional powers, are solidly aligned with one or the other camps. There's a handful of conflict dyads, which in the case of the Cold War was, obviously the inter-German border and Western Europe itself, where Warsaw Pact and NATO met quite literally and faced off, and the Korean Peninsula. I mean, that's more complicated because the fact that North Korea borders both Russia and China, and it's across the sea from Japan. Like that would always be a weird geopolitical kind of a
hotspot.
Yeah, exactly. But the reality is the Cold War that very easily could have, and especially by the 1970s, 1980s, as the Pacific became more critical for various reasons, that definitely could have happened. But you're basically looking at two scenarios where, or you're basically looking at like two major theaters where the conflict could be triggered, and like I said, the only you're talking about an incredibly narrow range of conflict dyads. I mean, in a multipolar world, there's not, and even then too, like it assumes. Nuclear weapons only really become a thing when you can't realistically
win the conventional military.
Yeah, exactly. Now, the revolution in military affairs, and that really was kind of a game changer. That, Russell Stolfe wrote a great book about Adolf Hitler. He wrote a book with this former Wehrmacht general whose name eludes me, but who was an early NATO war planner, and they made the case for a conventional combined arms defense of Europe in the 1980s, and they said this is definitely possible. And there's absolutely no reason why, in event of a general war, there must be a nuclear escalation. And interestingly, Tom Clancy's Red Storm Rising, which is a great simulation, that's based on that same calculus. But this idea that nuclear weapons are just kind of this have this kind of broad utility, kind of in all epochs and in all strategic landscapes, that really is really is nonsense. And this idea that first of all, the Russian the Russians have always abided, or they claim their stated policy. I mean, even during the Soviet days and today, has always been that they, is no first strike. For a time, it was believed that that Soviet doctrine was to launch on warning, like in other words, just like launch upon detection of enemy launch. But it was always a reactive. It was always a reactive policy or doctrine, strategic doctrine. With biological and chemical weapons, that was not the case. They had no formal position on that, but it's a subject for a different pod. But chemical weapons actually did have utility and do, frankly, in ways that that nuclear weapons don't, and that's unfortunate. And I believe that I believe they would have had great utility, frankly, like in a NATO Warsaw Pact conflict in Central Europe in the 1980s. But like I said, it's a topic for another episode. But yeah, nuclear weapons are essentially obsolete. I mean, I know that kind of like you don't hear this as much now, but I know that kind of the big scare story or the kind of scenario that made people really upset, in the 90s and into the 2000s, was some rogue state or some Nazi actor like Al Qaeda is just going to detonate a nuclear weapon. But I mean, like, what would that really get you? Like terrorism actually does have a strategic logic to it. Like Al Qaeda struck on 9/11 because Bin Laden's notion was to draw the United States into a kind of open conflict with the Sunni world, which would solve a lot of their problems, allow them, that would be the catalyzing event, that would topple these kinds of secular dictatorships and things, that would
also pro-Western monarchies in the Gulf, like Saudi
yeah,
Arabia.
exactly. And it would give them cachet because they'd be fighting Americans, like in the Holy Land, presumably, and this would be this would be like the Mujahideen's war against the communists in Afghanistan, times 1,000. Like that was his idea. Like the idea, you don't carry out terrorist acts just because you really want to blow up the World Trade Center or because you really want to like waste a bunch of civilians for no reason. I mean, yeah, like the terror aspect of it, is like literally, like part of the reason it's effective. But like this idea that Al Qaeda is just, is chomping at the bit to, to detonate a nuke, in Fairfax, Virginia, or something, like that doesn't really make a lot of sense. I mean, it's possible, but again, it doesn't. That's not really the tool. I mean, I'm not trying to be flippant about people dying and terrorism, but that's not really the proverbial tool for the job. So yeah, that's
There are things far more effective and easily available to get than nuclear weapons.
Well, yeah, exactly.
Chemical weapons are just an example of that.
Yeah, that too, and it's also yeah, exactly. So I mean, it's but I mean, I made the point again and again, and I think I have some perspective because I'm getting old, and I came of age right around the time the Cold War was ending rather dramatically. America really, in structural terms, it's kind of oriented to fight the Cold War and not, or structured to fight the Cold War and not much else. And these people became locked into that kind of thinking. I mean, it's even if even if you have kind of a neoconish view, I'm not you, but like even a person who does, I mean, I think that's a crazy view to have. But even if you believe that, okay, America's got to, kind of, through a combination of legerdemain, subterfuge, and violence, kind of like attack other societies, to homogenize them, and break them of their practices and values and preferences. Yeah. Like even if your idea is like, kind of creating this sort of like world empire where the regime based in Washington is truly hegemonic. Like the way you go about doing that isn't by utilizing the way forces are structured today, and by these institutions like CIA, which are basically the State Department, but with a mandate to kill people when it wants to. Like it's not, and like military, like even if NATO wasn't an aggressive well, it wasn't basically just like an alibi for aggressive unilateral military action by America. Like alliances like NATO are dead. Like that's not how you structure military alliances anymore. Something like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, like that's kind of the face of alliances today. Like it eliminates a lot of the kind of difficulties with with forces operating like across national frontiers and things. It habituates people to integrated command and control for limited purposes and for specific operational objectives. Like things like that. There's like an interdependence aspect of it too. That that has the effect of creating kind of closer bonds between regimes that face common strategic challenges. Like
Yeah, they're all benefiting. It's not just one single power.
Yeah, that's the
the
face of it.
U.S., mainly NATO, that
Yeah,
benefits from
it's
all
not.
of its actions.
Yeah, and it's not, and it's also too. It's not ordered like okay, like we're gonna like we're we're gonna assign this country like defense of this region, and they've got 4 like dedicated armored divisions, and then like this battle group, from this country, is responsible for this territory and event a theoretical attack according to our probable war scenario. That's just not how things are. That's 30 years out of date. So it's I make that point to people a lot. But I mean that's the whole thing. Like it's these these bureaucracies, these IGOs, they just be like their raison d'etre to continue to exist is simply to continue to exist. And that's incredibly dysfunctional. But I mean, NATO. Nobody can seriously believe NATO exists. I mean, Turkey is the only other NATO country that really has a real combat capability. And American Turkey are periodically at war with each other by proxy. You're not in an alliance with people who you go to war with regularly. I mean, like even if it's by proxy, like it's absurd. It's ridiculous. But even were it not, again, like it's not. It's an outmoded structure.
So I want to get your thoughts on this because I watch some of these more liberal geopolitic thinkers and kind of war philosophers who are kind of seeing how the situation in Ukraine is progressing as the days go by, and they seem to all have this conceptual notion that with this, the Russia's imminent defeat by Ukraine with Western supplied weapons, that Russia as a state will collapse, and that would be beneficial for democracy worldwide. And that kind of seems to be their aim now with this conflict. It goes beyond just Ukraine. Now it's about dismantling Russia so they can recapture those resources, those cheap like oil and gas in the Ural Mountains and the Caucasus for Western Europe mainly. What do you think about that?
I mean, there's a few things. First of all, democratic peace theory is asinine. Even were it not asinine, what these liberal theorists are talking about, it's not something that it's not an ideology that appeals to anybody. All right, it's not. This is not the 1980s where you can sell people on kind of where there's people kind of wallowing behind the Iron Curtain. Yeah, and like they look at America, and it's kind of like at least the veneer of it is very is something that's very appealing. Oh, it's like the socially conservative. I mean, on the surface, I mean, kind of like superpower. We're like people have this kind of like stable family life, but they also enjoy this kind of prosperity that's that's unthinkable, in most of the world. You can, like I said, democratic peace theory is asinine anyway, but at least that, in the abstract, it can be understood how that would like resonate with people in some basic capacity. Especially if you accept kind of primitive caricatures of the human mind and soul, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like what on earth do people find appealing about America? Like they want more, like they want parades dedicated to sodomy. They want racial conflict. They want bureaucracies dedicated to eradicating people's ability to practice their culture. Like why would anybody want that? Secondly, about the worst way to try to destabilize a regime is to develop a proxy state on their border that's based on hatred of the ethnicity that's the majority in the country you want to destabilize. Like, you're basically going to radicalize and harden those people against you, no matter how horrible their government is. And basically, what America did was it entirely radicalized Ukraine against the Russian-speaking minority, which is about 1/3 of the country, to the point of genocidal hostility. Now, how on earth would that make Russians decide they don't like their government? I mean, like, even people who hate Putin are not going to embrace, the slaughter of their countrymen, and the kind of deracination of their people, and that outright annihilation of them. I mean, this is very basic stuff. But also, I make the point again and again to people, the degree of, I'm the last person who's going to sit here and drop Soviet apologia in any epoch, but the degree of devastation levied against the Soviet Union by the Axis powers is almost unbelievable. Between in 4 years, they lost 1 in 7 of their population. Okay, around 25 million Soviet citizens died. I mean, the Wehrmacht was literally at the gates of Moscow. It's so the idea that some sort of like border, some kind of like astroturf border war, is going to like make Russia collapse. I mean, that's absurd. I mean, Russia's a truly ancient society. And you think, I mean, whatever you say about Russians, I mean, people like to, there's people with a lot of prejudices about Eastern Slavs, frankly. I mean, and even if all those things were true, one thing you can't say about Russians is that they're a soft people. And this idea that, they're going to run out waving like little sodomy flags and saying like, I like G.I. Joe, me want Hershey bar, if we kill enough of them and degrade their culture enough and like build up this kind of like mafia regime that the genocidal hatred of them in Ukraine. This is like literally delusional. It's plus, I mean, if you're a person, I mean, there is like an ethical component here too. If you're a person who wants to annihilate societies that haven't done anything to you and tear out their root, destroy their traditional practices, annihilate their ability to observe their culture, destroy the social capital that creates intimacy between them, you're an evil person. Like, that's a horrible thing to do. Like, why would you want to do that? Any person with a normal moral compass would find that horrible. Now, there's times, unfortunately, in total war where if your survival depends upon the extermination of another, yes, that may become a reality. And the Roman histories are full of this. The Bible is full of these incidents. This is something that happens, unfortunately. It is not something that you seek out to make happen because you decide you don't like it that Russians aren't welcoming enough of some sexual paraphilia that you like, or because you don't like the fact that they're a traditional.
They have influence over historical territory that has always been part of the Russian sphere of influence.
Well, that's the thing too. It's like, even if that's what's like the most bizarre about the Ukraine thing. First of all, Zelensky is about the most unattractive person I can think of in political life today. But beyond that, if you deploy if you deploy hostile forces 300 miles from the Russian capital, they're going to respond. I mean, that's inevitable. This is reality. This is a fact. Even if a Boris Yeltsin type was in the Kremlin, the Russians would attack. There's certain inevitable conflict dyads that once you cross, you are at war. Okay. If hypersonic Chinese missile platforms begin appearing on the Mexican border, the United States would attack them. It would be inevitable. Okay, so you can't declare that Russia is evil because it's not going to tolerate weapon systems at decapitation range on its border. Like, you can't declare that Russia's evil because it's not gonna welcome the ethnic cleansing of the Russian-speaking minority in the Donbass. Like no, if no Russian chief executive would tolerate that. Like right wing, left wing, like liberal, reactionary, like nobody would. And anyone who made overtures that he may tolerate that would be removed from office. I mean,
Yeah,
it's
he
just
would just be
like,
an open CIA stooge at that point, a literal puppet.
well, it's just not like, and I mean, if you want to demoralize your enemy, you don't do it by you don't do it by carving out some kind of like mafia run client state on their border, stoking an ethnic, stoking a race war, basically, creating an emergent situation, and then shrieking at your enemy for responding to it that you're evil, like that. That's not. I mean, this is not how politics is done, and it doesn't really get you anything. I mean, yeah, it might make a bunch of infotainment consumers agitated, but I mean, on the world stage, you look crazy if you do that, and you're not going to get your way. I mean, but it's also, Ukraine could have beaten Russia without firing a shot. They could have taken the $15 billion in developmental aid that Putin offered them, as a bribe, obviously. They could have declared neutrality, formal neutrality. They could have low key, like, built their army up to, ridiculous, to ridiculous degrees. And there's really nothing the Russians could have done about it. Because the minute any Russian forces traversed that border, the world opinion would have been outraged. Like, what are you talking? The Ukrainians declared neutrality, and you're reneging on your promise to respect that, and Ukraine can they can maintain whatever forces in being they want, which is and the case would be made, well, it's understandable considering their situation, but this idea of, I mean, what I'm getting at is that what happened with Ukraine is that Washington pursued a policy of war at all costs. They would not accept anything short of a catastrophic war with Russia. That was the point of this policy. And if your policy is literally war at all costs, you're not talking about normal politics. Okay, you're talking about a crusade. The purpose of which is simply to destroy. Okay, is to destroy human life for its own sake, and it's not legitimate. And even if it were, you don't get to cultivate something like that and then shriek over and over that the people affected by it are evil. If you punch me in the face, I'm going to punch you back. I'm not an evil man because I'm punching you back. I mean, Putin's not an evil man because he doesn't welcome.
Submit to the U.S.
Well, I mean, like I said, it's like, no, you can have the most like liberal-minded kind of like NGO sponsored, like reform-minded Russian president in the Kremlin. If you deploy at the capitation range in Ukraine, you're going to be at war with Russia. I mean, that's, like I said, it's not, if that's not, that's arguably the only legitimate scenario where military force is applied. I mean, I don't believe that, but I'm saying that, like, if you want to take a very kind of moralist posture on it. Plus, anyone's good for the goose, good for the gander. Okay, if Russia has no right to, if Russia is, if it's quote illegal for Russia to defend its frontier, then the Monroe Doctrine is not legitimate either. Okay, that means that any hostile state can deploy in the Western Hemisphere or even in the Americas if they want to. If you can deploy the Russian border and it's illegal for them to retaliate, then, well, anybody who wants can deploy on the Mexican border. Why can't the Sinaloa cartel do whatever it wants? It's there's no right to defend your border from hostile actors.
No, it's really is insane logic by these people, and yet these are the same people telling us that we can have limited nuclear war because Russia might counterattack in the winter or something. These are the same people pushing these strategies in the Pentagon currently, and these liberal geopolitical strategists, whatever we want to call them, kind of facilitating this narrative on social media platforms. It's pure lunacy.
Oh yeah, it's bizarre. Well, it's also to this idea that, I mean, Ukraine is a worthless country. Like, it really is. It's totally dysfunctional. There's nothing there. Like, why? So saying like the Russians are irredentist madmen who just want to invade Ukraine for no reason. Why on earth would anybody want Ukraine? Like nobody wants Ukraine. It's a basket case. It's a shithole. Russia's in Ukraine because NATO is utilizing it as a basing platform. And like I said, at the decapitation range, that constitutes an existential threat. You know, I mean, what on earth would anybody want with it? Or this idea that like, oh, Putin's a madman. Now next he's going to attack Poland. Like that's not how the world works. You know, I mean, like this idea that people just, this idea that heads of like chief executives of major powers, they just decide they're going to like invade countries for no reason. Like, what are the odds that a man like Putin, president of the Russian Federation, or like take even something like Erdogan, okay? Like, what are the odds that even a highly corrupt executive like Erdogan, he's just going to decide one day he's going to like attack other countries for no reason? I mean, like, what are the odds of that? You know, if you're like so fucking basic, that's the way you approach the world. Like, maybe you shouldn't be talking about politics or like, deciding you have opinions on things. You know, it's like I don't decide to like I know about nuclear physics and just say shit. You know what I mean? It's and this idea too that plus I mean you don't get to have a quote unquote opinion on this if you can't. Like I've told people before too, like these people like mouth off about the Second World War and like tell me what I'm talking about. It's like, I'm 46 years old. I've literally spent my entire life studying this. It's like if you can't name the 5 key engagements of the war, you can't even tell me what years the war occurred. Like you don't get to have some like hard as fuck opinion on it. Because you don't even have an opinion. You just got you like watch some movie or something, or you read some dispatch on Twitter from some NGO, and like you just decided that you just like decided to become like emotionally invested in it, like the way somebody gets invested in some like cable drama movie or something. It's ridiculous. I got to dip in a minute, man. But I'm sorry this was too scattershot, man. I'm not feeling too great today, and I was kind of worn out. But we can take this up again too if you want to deeper dive into the issue of nuclear weapons and kind of the development of strategic doctrine therein, and what the implications for policy and all that good stuff, and why this still like looms large in people's minds. I mean, I'm talking to people who know better, people who actually have worthwhile things to say. I'm not talking about the idiots in the commentary, but
sure, again, man, that's fine. I guess I'll close the stream. Is there anything you'd like to kind of show as we're closing out? Anything you'd like to promote?
I mean, I've been on Burb app since Elon took over, and I mean, you could find me there. I mean, I don't get into heavy content there, obviously, but it's a good place to connect. If you search for me, you shall find. I'm on Substack. That's where you can find the podcast. It's real Thomas777.substack.com. The Steel Store manuscript. Imperium Press and I were sincerely hoping it would drop before the year's end, but we've had trouble finding a printer because people are I'm being canceled, but that is getting resolved. It's a minor setback, and I mean, worst case scenario, if I truly could not find like a printer anywhere, I'd serialize it on my Substack or something. Okay, but it'll drop in January. It's getting resolved. So I'm going to be looking for that. At long last, I am launching the YouTube channel. And that's what I'm dedicating the day to tomorrow is, prepping content for that and what have you. But that's what I got, man. And like I said, again, I'm not feeling great today. So forgive me if I seem a bit out of it and a little scattershot in my thinking.
No, that's fine. It's understandable, man. If you guys did enjoy the conversation, please like and subscribe, as I greatly appreciate it and helps out the channel. And remember, the lie can't last